When it comes to U.S. bank failures, there are more than one might think, but U.S. bank failures for the year 2023 have happened all at alarming speeds. So far this year, 4 and counting. At the same time, bank withdrawals are also happening at warp speed. Figures vary from around $300 to $400 billion. Some estimates have put it at over $1 trillion. Well, what has happened? The banks so far, the excuse they have used, rising interest rates. Is that the only reason? Or like previous bank failures, failed investments, or having rising interest rates which led to investment failures? Well, in this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at the state of the U.S. banking system and why they are failing. Where are the regulators, by the way? Also, we will take a look at the wider U.S. economy at the same time. First, let me introduce our guests. John Edmunds, Professor of Finance at Babson College at Wellesley, Mass., joins us. Also joining us, Marcia Baker, economic expert at the Executive Intelligence Review, who joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to you both. So let me start with you, John Edmunds. Let me see, what do I have? I have my first question: emergency meetings, central banks offering credit lifelines, and tumbling bank shares. So basic question, are U.S. banks in trouble? I mean, are we looking at, so far, 4 bank failures and more to come based on some reports, or it's not as bad as some are saying?
I would say that it's bad in terms of the design of a commercial bank. They're intrinsically vulnerable to crises of the sort that we have seen. The reason is that the depositors cannot see the exact condition of the loan portfolio of the bank. So it's what we call an asymmetry of information. That is, say, one side knows what they need to know and the other side doesn't know what they need to know. As to whether there would be more, there would be mergers and rescues, and that's kind of normal in U.S. banking. If you go back some years, you would find there were 8,000 banks or something like that in the United States, and the number is now down to something like 4,500 and declining. But it's particularly the so-called regional banks that are in the spotlight right now, because they're big enough to be systemically important, but not big enough to be regulated as if they were.
Okay, you mentioned a stat, and you kind of skim over it as if it's not a big deal. I mean, Marcia Baker, I guess there said about 8,000 banks have closed. My records say between the years 2017 and 2021, 7,425 branches actually. 9% of them, it says, of all locations. I mean, that's not a good thing, is it? When you have around 7,500 banks closing? I mean, that should ring some kind of alarm bell, shouldn't it?
Yes, I think so. And also, but understand, it's not just one incident. I think we're in a phase shift for the worst that was bound to happen if you look at certain things, and we need emergency solutions to get out of it. So take just this week, the agreement to continue to allow the debt ceiling to go ahead. It's good not to have a shock to the economy, but how did we get here? We've had a lot of deregulated lending since the end of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, and then there were subsequent acts. So we've had more free-for-all banking and less investment in actual physical infrastructure to support the economy. And so what we've got is we're in the crisis phase. I mentioned a phase. We've had 50, 60 years of what you could call casino economics, where you aren't having lending for increased productivity, but you're having all kinds of creative and other speculation. And the chickens are coming home to roost. And so that's what has to be addressed. And I'll just say right at the beginning, there's the beginnings of that in Congress when the Glass-Steagall reenactment, that's not the name of the bill, but a bill to reintroduce the Glass-Steagall regulations of having sound credit extension versus unlimited speculation. That was introduced in March or April by Marcia, the Congresswoman from Ukraine. It may only have under 15 sponsors, but that's indicative of the direction we should go.
All right, give us your idea about what we are looking at for explanations, John Edmunds. interest rates is said to be one of the major things mentioned by some of the CEOs or former CEOs of some of the bank failures. And I'm talking generally now in terms of my question to you, which has created unrealized losses in investment securities, as it is said, and of course, perhaps other reasons. What is the deal with the interest rates and bank failures?
Well, I quite agree with Marcy's overall description. And what happened was we had a long period of time with extremely low interest rates to allow the economy to grow, and it grew in an unbalanced fashion, as she said. And then they raised rates to control inflation, and the unintended side effect of that was that the cost for banks to acquire money went up, and also when the banks weren't paying it quickly enough, some of their deposits went out to, let's say, money market mutual funds, which are nowhere near as vulnerable to failure. So I would say we're in a consolidation period, but it's going to be ragged and not intended, because we had a period in the Great Depression where there was a reaction against concentration in the banking sector, and so they went to breaking up banks and creating little regional banks, local banks, and the local banks generally were much more successful in the popular imagination than the regional banks. The regional banks were kind of like not really intended that they should get so big, and at the same time there was a wave to deregulate the regional banks. They do regulate the mega banks, the huge ones. But
what do you mean by that? Can you explain? Because that was one of my questions. When you say they do regulate the bigger banks, does that mean they don't regulate the smaller banks as much?
Well, the smaller neighborhood banks, they don't regulate them as tightly, because if one of them failed, it wouldn't really cause a cascade. It wouldn't cause a domino effect quite so devastating as the one that we got with Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank, if you look at their aggregate size, was not really that big, but it had the deposits of the companies that got venture capital and the companies that did an IPO. If they did an IPO and did not use all the money immediately, they would have it on deposit at Silicon Bank, and very suddenly it looked like those deposits would be frozen. So the entire Silicon Valley high-tech space would have been really quite curtailed, and that was bad enough. But then besides that, Silicon Valley Bank had a Canadian and a UK affiliate which were doing the same thing. So by allowing one bank to fail, we could have frozen the high-tech sector of Silicon Valley and Canada and the UK.
Sir, since you mentioned Silicon Valley Bank, Marcia Baker, the former chief executive, actually sold some stocks there before it failed. And I'm going to actually quote you what the Ohio Senator, Sherrod Brown, asked this former Silicon Valley Bank CEO. We know your banks were fatally mismanaged. The next obvious question is why? Why did you let things get so bad? Why did you ignore admonitions from regulators? And he said the simple answer is that we know that executives were getting rich. And this is because the former CEO filed what's called a 10b5-1 plan, which before your bank failed, $3.6 million worth of stock were sold. So do you think that the CEOs were at fault here?
Well, I'm not up on the exact ins and outs of what can get into the realm of corruption, mismanagement of individual entities. Maybe my fellow panelist, John, can do that. But I want to stay on the systemic side, that we're on thin ice now. Don't think we've just had 4 significant, impressive failures and that's it. Look at what's happened in Switzerland. Look at look at the entire system for a moment. And when it comes to banking, look at all the headline events in the United States this past week about celebrating that Republicans and Democrats got together to extend the debt ceiling. In fact, what we have is what we have underneath it is real credit for a sound, productive base in the economy. Is not easy to come by, is not happening. All eyes are on which will be the next failure. So that's the way it should be looked at, not just congratulations to Joe Biden or to the Republican side. for coming up with a plan to put off worrying about the debt until after the next presidential election,
Okay.
which is what they did.
All right, that's a valid point. So let's talk about that. I mean, on a general sense, if you want to take a look at this debt ceiling that was resolved, John Edmunds, I mean, is that a good thing to have this really come down to the wire and then for there to be some kind of agreement, which happens every so often, and you have all these employees, basically governmental employees, on the one hand, who are so worried that, you know, if there's going to be a government shutdown, they're not going to get paid. Let alone you have people in the Army also.
They shouldn't have been the only ones that were worried. In fact, one of the things that I found distressing about the whole debt ceiling tightrope walk that they put us through is nobody in the financial press really came out and said how really bad that would have been. It would have caused widespread financial ramifications, which would have been really quite damaging and would have caused a whole bunch of people to liquidate their bank accounts if they could and get silver coins or go to gold or something like that. And that would drastically reduce credit in the United States. It would make the Great Depression look like a picnic. But I think we're both of us are agreeing that what we have is a massive system which is full of all sorts of defective designs and things that can be remedied. But just staying on the debt ceiling, that's how the House of Representatives controls expenditure, and it's extremely crude, and there should be a better way to do it, but they always come down to it, and then they like to really go right up to the precipice. Now, I found that extremely distressing because for this Congress, the rule was changed that only one person in the House of Representatives can say, I have no confidence in the Speaker. And then they would have had to have a vote to re-elect the Speaker, and the Speaker would probably have lost. Mm-hmm. And so we would have gone over the cliff. We would have gone into default. And that would be so bad, it takes a separate show to tell you all the unexpected ramifications of it.
We're looking at bank runs. There's no denying in that, Marcia Baker. I'm sure you agree with that. There's a massive bank run that's happening in the U.S. with the banks. Now, conservative figures are putting that at around $300 to $400 billion. There was a couple sources that said it could be as high as $1 trillion. I'm not too sure if we can take that source to be a viable one. But even $300 to $400 billion is a massive run. You have the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, insisting as of March 16th that the banking system remains sound. This comes days after two of the three largest banks failed. How do you assess the way that the officials like Janet Yellen, like even the U.S. President Joe Biden, who has assured Americans that there's no problem with the banking system, that is indeed the case? I mean, they can't come out and say, we do have a problem, because I think if they said that, there'd be more panic and people would withdraw their money even more. But how do you assess the way they've handled it?
Well, it's coherent with, I'll add another feature to what you just correctly described. It's coherent with the idea that, frankly, you could have a war economy indefinitely. Look at the continued announcements of the volumes of money in the United States or the Netherlands last week or Germany, or the continued commitments for armaments in Ukraine. That is opposed to negotiations. I'm saying it's over time to have talks on behalf of all humanity to come to a resolution over the situation. But instead, another 300 million, another 300 million. And in the agreement on the debt ceiling, the defense element remains agreed to by all sides, not all sides, but the official Republican and Democratic sides. And you get other crazy cuts showing a non-conceptualization of the economy. And so I think that the idea of constituency leadership couldn't be more important, whether it's the farm sector, small business, large industry, the health sector of the country. These things are all at stake. You can't go on with the war economy, armaments from, Bethlehem, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania or somewhere, and run a whole economy on that. We have a physical economic as well as a fiscal and a monetary crisis. We're in that period, and we need the leadership for, I mentioned Glass-Steagall, but it's not pie in the sky. We need to have the right thinking and people stepping up to push the right policies.
Well, there's something going on when it comes to the U.S. banking system, and I'm wondering, John Edmunds, if this is correct. You don't really see it being covered, and in regards to how some are saying that there is a consolidation that's going on. At the same time, there are these small banks, as we've mentioned, so many to have gone out of business or for the doors to have shut, that they're not preventing them from failing. They, meaning the people in charge, such as Janet Yellen, such as perhaps even the U.S. President, where they want this consolidation of banks to actually happen, because then they can focus on the larger banks and monitor, perhaps, I should say, maybe, how they handle the money that way. Do you believe that that may be the case?
I think that's where we're headed without really intending. But if I can go back to the statement of Janet Yellen and Joe Biden, individually, the loans in most banks' portfolios are healthy in the sense that the borrower has adequate revenue and provision in order to be able to pay the loan on schedule. That's what they mean. But the system itself is vulnerable to these runs and panics. And that's the massive design defect that we need to address at a world level, because this is no longer the U.S. banking system. This is the U.S. banking system, which is linked to so many banking systems around the world, and that's what the debate hasn't really covered. But you also mentioned constituents, and there's a lot of congressional representatives who were sent to Washington with specific marching orders. Specifically, there's a significant component of the American public who really doesn't want to have a central bank. They don't want to have the Federal Reserve. And they really don't even, some of them don't even want paper money. They'd like to go back to using silver coins, and they'd like to go back to ranching and agriculture, and that's atavistic, but not realistic. So I was very worried about the debt ceiling, because if they had not increased it, pretty much every bank in America would have been technically insolvent, because they had government bonds of various maturities as part of their safe money. And if the safe money would be defaulted bonds, the auditors would have to say you can't count that, and consequently you're below your capital adequacy ratios, and you must be liquidated. But how do you liquidate a bank if all the other banks are being liquidated at the same time? This was never addressed. I never heard this in the debate, and I was really waiting for it. So I would say we have a consolidation going on, but it's going to be rough. It's going to be ugly, because the American people really don't want their little local banks and so on to be rolled up. And they also, it was very clear when Silicon Valley Bank failed, Bank America Chase was ready to take over, and they were told, no, we want to merge that with another regional bank, because we didn't want the concentration of the banking system to get any higher. And then finally, they kind of had to allow it, because otherwise, having a little bit of increase in concentration in the banking system that we didn't want, we can fix that later. But if we crash the entire system, there wouldn't be that much ladder. You couldn't fix it. It'd be hard to put back together again.
Okay, I'm trying to get a gauge as to how this reflects on the wider economy, Marcia Baker, in terms of the bank failures and in terms of people withdrawing their money, in terms of how we're looking at the fact that money to be lent is not in the works for the banks. Generally speaking, overall, credit is very tight, and therefore that leads to less consumer spending, perhaps. And of course, the rising interest rates, of course, that affects credit also. What is your assessment when it comes to the U.S. economy, aside from the numbers that are given that mostly seem to be painting a rosy picture in one way or another? But how do you see it?
I think we are in a worsening phase of a crisis. I see it as a crisis, because if you take, for example, you mentioned actually there's less lending for important things or anything. And if you take the condition of the economy that was even indicated in the new agreement on the debt ceiling, it was mentioned that the people receiving food help through a program called SNAP, that needs to be tightened up, except for veterans and elderly, and they should have jobs. Where are they going to have jobs, and what kind of jobs? If there was a particularly outstanding thing, the Mountain Valley Pipeline, to take the Marcellus shale gas from West Virginia to the coast, that it should go ahead. Now, we need pipelines, but we're not building nuclear. We have an incoherent system. Every category, whether it's basic food, basic conveyance in gas and oil and energy, whether it's transportation, the economy has obvious examples of decline. Look at the water need in the West. After a while, if you use the Ogallala Aquifer, for example, in the western states, with a growing population and activity, it may be depleted. But we could have been doing something about this for decades if we didn't have casino economics. We could have had a continental scale North American Water and Power Alliance project proposed in the 60s. And and that kind of thing. So that's not going on, and the chickens are coming home to roost.
All right.
And so that's what's at stake.
Can I reaffirm what you said earlier, that if somebody withdraws money from a bank and puts it into a money market mutual fund, the person who does that feels that their money is more safe, and indeed it is. But what happens is the bank then doesn't have money to lend to a smaller, medium-sized business.
Let me ask you something on that note. I'm sorry to jump in, because this is the last question I'm going to ask. Tell me if this is correct, because this is really kind of mind-boggling. A terminology by the name bail-in, where it says it affects the rights of a depositor. It's another form based on this definition where banks and financial institutions, they're rescued, where the responsibility is transferred from the taxpayers, and it goes actually to the in this case, the depositors, which are the ones who are depositing that. Is that actually accurate? Is that what happens? And what about the banks who are sitting on all this volatile money where it's been invested and they're called bad investments? Does that mean the depositors? Is it going to reach a point, my final question, that the U.S. government may limit Americans, people's access to their money?
No, I agree with your point that it's called a bail-in when the depositors would also suffer. But if the depositors are at risk, then they wouldn't put their money in the bank in the first place. So the people who get wiped out are the shareholders of the bank, and that's live by that and die by it. But they're supposed to have diversified portfolios. But somebody puts their money in a bank, if they think that they would go in there a few days later and not be able to get it out, they wouldn't put it in the first place. Instead, they would put it in their mattress, which is what they did in the early 1930s, and that made the Great Depression a lot worse because it reduced the circulation of money. So a lot of prices fell farther than they should have.
Sure.
And a lot of people lost their farms and businesses.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're fresh out of time. Wish we had more time. John Edmunds, professor of finance at Babson College there from Wellesley, Mass. Marcia Baker, pleasure economic expert at EIR from Washington, D.C. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mikava Tatway and the team, it's goodbye.